fall asleep to the mark of Cain, the killer. God refused to let die. Before we begin tonight, I want to ask you something. Have you ever done something you cannot undo? Not a small failure, not an ordinary regret that softens with the years. Something with a name, something that changed another person's life, or ended it, or ended the person you thought you were before you did it. And afterward, in the long silence that follows a thing like that, did some part of you believe you deserved to disappear? Tonight, we are going to meet the first person in the entire Bible to ask God directly for death and be refused. Not because his crime was small. His crime was the first murder in human history, committed against his own brother, in a field, in what the text implies was cold and premeditated anger, rather than a sudden loss of control. And when God finally speaks to him after it happens, God does not kill him. God does not even exile him without protection. God marks him. And the mark, whatever it was, existed for exactly one purpose: to keep him alive. This is one of the strangest mercies in the whole of Scripture, and one of the least examined, because we tend to read the story of Cain the way we read a warning sign, quickly, and move on before the deeper and more uncomfortable question underneath it has a chance to surface. What kind of God protects a murderer? And what does it mean that the very first act of divine mercy, recorded after Eden, is not extended to someone innocent, but to someone guilty of the worst thing a person can do? Settle in, let the lamp burn low. This is a story that will ask you to sit with the possibility that the mark on Cain's forehead was never a brand of shame. It may have been the opposite. The first tattoo of protection ever placed on a human body, drawn there by the hand of the one being in all creation, who still, somehow, after everything, was not finished with him. We are just beginning. Chapter 1. The first birth outside the garden. To understand what happens in the field between Cain and Abel, we have to go back further than the field itself, back to the strange and heavy world both brothers were born into, a world neither of them chose and neither of them could remember any other way of living. Their parents had been in the garden. Adam and Eve had walked in whatever way the ancient text allows us to imagine walking, in the direct and unmediated presence of God, in a place where nothing had yet gone wrong, where the ground gave freely and the air held no grief in it. And then it ended, not slowly, in a single afternoon, in a single choice made under a single tree. The gate closed, and the cherubim were set at the entrance with a flaming sword that turned every direction, and the two people who had known that garden walked east of it into a world that had never existed before because it had never needed to. A world with distance in it, a world where God's presence was no longer a given, a world where work had to be wrestled from resistant ground, where the woman would bring forth children in pain, where every single day going forward would carry the memory of a door that used to stand open and did not any longer. Cain was born into that world, not into the garden his parents remembered, into the exile that came after it. Genesis tells us that Eve, at his birth, said something remarkable, something worth holding on to, because it tells us what kind of child Cain was to his mother before he became anything else in the story. I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. Some translations render it even more directly. I have created a man as the Lord did. There is pride in that sentence, and hope, and something almost defiant. A woman who had just lost paradise announcing that she had, in the middle of the loss, brought something new into being. Cain's name itself in the Hebrew plays on the word for acquiring, for gaining, and his birth is presented to us as exactly that, a gain, a first light after a very great darkness. Abel comes after him, and the text gives his birth almost no ceremony at all by comparison, no declaration from his mother, just a name, which in Hebrew carries the sense of breath or vapor or something that does not last. Scholars have long noticed the shadow already sitting inside that name, the way it seems to know before the story has even properly begun, how briefly this second son would be permitted to live. The two brothers grow. The text tells us plainly what work each of them took up. Abel became a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. Neither vocation is presented as better than the other. Both were necessary. Both were honest labor in a world that now demanded labor from everyone in it. I want you to hold that detail carefully, because so much of what follows will be misread if you assume the story is building toward one brother being fundamentally good and the other fundamentally corrupt from the very beginning. It is not. It is building toward something much closer to home. Two brothers, raised by the same exiled parents, carrying the same inherited grief for a garden neither of them had ever personally walked in, each finding his own way to bring something back to the God whose presence they had only ever heard about second-hand. And then comes the offering. Chapter 2, 2 altars, 1 silence. In the course of time, the text says, Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. I want to slow down here, because the entire tragedy that follows hinges on 4 words most readers move past without a second thought. And Abel also brought. Also, which means Cain brought first. Which means, whatever else we come to understand about this story, we should not lose sight of the fact that it was Cain, the elder brother, the worker of the resistant ground, who first thought to bring something back to God at all. In a world only 2 generations removed from Eden, in a family still learning what worship even looked like without a garden to walk it in, Cain was the one who initiated the offering. He was not a boy indifferent to God. He was, by every indication the text gives us, a man reaching toward the God his parents remembered, doing the only thing he knew how to do, bringing the fruit of the labor his own hands had wrestled from a ground that no longer gave itself away for free. Abel followed his brother's lead and brought from the firstborn of his flock the fat portions, the very best of what he had. And here the text delivers its verdict with a bluntness that has troubled careful readers for 3,000 years. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. The text does not tell us why. This is the detail I most want you to sit with tonight, because so much of the damage in this story, and so much of the damage in every story, like it that has played out in every family since, grows directly out of that silence. We are not told that Cain's offering was inferior in kind. Grain offerings appear elsewhere in the law, given to Israel centuries later, as fully acceptable, fully holy, in no way lesser than an offering of flesh. We are not told, in this earliest telling, that Cain withheld his best while Abel gave his best, though later Jewish and Christian interpreters, reading backward from what Cain does next, have often assumed exactly that, have often imagined Cain handing over whatever was left over, the bruised fruit, the poor portion, while Abel gave freely from the very finest of his flock. It is a reasonable inference. It may even be correct. But the text itself, in the moment it happens, gives us no explanation at all. Just the fact of it. One brother's offering received, the other's not. Think about what that must have felt like from the inside, because I think this is where the story actually begins to breathe, not in the theology of acceptable sacrifice, but in the excruciating, ordinary human experience of watching someone you love receive something you reached for and did not get. Cain had been first. Cain had initiated the whole practice of bringing something back to God, and Cain watched his younger brother's identical gesture, offered second, received with warmth, while his own sat cold on the altar. The text tells us what this did to him in language that is almost clinical in its precision. Cain was very angry, and his face fell, not rage in the abstract. A very specific, very recognizable human collapse, the falling of the face. Anyone who has ever watched someone they love receive praise or preference or simple recognition that was withheld from them in the same breath knows exactly what that falling looks like, because most of us have felt our own face do it at some point. in some smaller version of this same ancient scene. And it is at exactly this moment, in the wreckage of that falling face, that God speaks to Cain directly for the first time in the entire story. Chapter 3. The warning at the door. "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen?" God asks him. Not a rhetorical question meant to shame him. A real question, offered the way a parent asks a child who has just been passed over for something. An invitation to name what he is actually feeling before it hardens into something worse. And then God says something that deserves to be read slowly, because it is one of the earliest and most important pieces of spiritual instruction given anywhere in the Bible, offered here to a man who has, as far as the text tells us, done nothing yet but feel a very human and very understandable grief. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. I want you to notice the posture God takes toward Cain in this moment, because it is not the posture of someone who has already written him off. It is the posture of someone standing beside him at a threshold, naming exactly what is waiting on the other side of the door. His anger has opened, and offering him directly the choice of whether to walk through it. Sin is crouching. The image is of a predator, low to the ground, patient, waiting for the exact moment weakness shows itself. And its desire, God says, using language that will be echoed almost word for word a few chapters later when God describes the desire a wife will have for her husband, is specifically for Cain. It wants him. It has been waiting for this precise wound, this precise falling of the face, because a wound like this is exactly the kind of opening a predator like that needs. And then the final sentence, which I think is the most important one in this entire opening scene, easy to read as a command and harder and more honest to read as what it actually is, an assurance. You must rule over it. Not you cannot, not you are already lost to it. You must, which in the grammar of this warning carries within it the quiet, embedded promise that Cain still can. The door is open, the predator is crouching, but the choice of whether to let it in has not yet been made, and God is standing right there beside him at the threshold, naming the danger out loud specifically so that Cain will not have to face it blind. This is, I think, one of the most tender moments in the whole book of Genesis, and one of the least remembered, because everyone remembers what Cain does next, and almost no one remembers that God tried, first, gently, directly, to stop it from happening. We do not know how long the silence lasted after God finished speaking. The text gives us no record of Cain answering, no record of him arguing or repenting, or even acknowledging that he had heard the warning at all. Just a single sentence, spare and terrible in its brevity, sitting immediately after God's words, the way a held breath sits before something breaks. Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Chapter 4. The field and the voice from the ground. I will not linger long on the act itself. The way the old tradition we have walked through on other nights has taught us to stay with the weight of terrible things without dwelling in their images longer than the record requires. What matters for the rest of this story is not the mechanics of what happened in that field. What matters is everything that happened in the silence immediately afterward, because it is in that silence that we begin to see the shape of the man Cain actually was. Underneath the anger, underneath the falling face, underneath the warning he had failed to heed. God speaks to him again, "Where is Abel your brother?" And here, I think, is the moment the entire story pivots, because God already knows the answer. This is not an investigation. This is the same kind of question God had asked Adam in the garden after the first transgression. "Where are you?" a question aimed not at gathering information God does not have, but at giving the guilty party one more chance to step forward honestly into the truth of what has happened, rather than deeper into the darkness of denying it. Cain does not take that chance. "I do not know," he says. "Am I my brother's keeper?" It is one of the most quoted lines in the entire Bible, and I think its fame has actually dulled us to how chilling it is in context. This is not a philosophical question about the nature of human responsibility, the way it is so often used today, stripped of its origin, and applied to arguments about social duty in general. In its original setting, it is a lie told directly to the face of God, by a man standing, we can only assume, with his brother's blood still on his hands, in the very field where the blood was spilled. It is denial compounded by defiance, grief refused a hearing and replaced instead with a sneer. And it is here, in the face of that lie, that the ground itself becomes a witness. "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground," God says. And then the sentence that gives this story its terrible permanent shape. "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Notice what has happened here, because it will matter enormously for everything that follows tonight. Cain, the worker of the ground, the man whose entire vocation and identity had been built around wresting sustenance from soil, is now cursed specifically in relation to that ground. The very thing he had brought as an offering, the fruit of his labor from the earth, will now refuse to labor with him. The relationship between this man and the world that had once, however grudgingly, sustained him, is broken. And beyond the broken ground, an even larger sentence: fugitive, wanderer, a man with no fixed place left to stand, cast out not merely from a garden the way his parents had been, but from the whole settled possibility of home. And Cain's response to this sentence is the moment I most want you to hear clearly tonight, because it is not what most retellings of this story remember him saying, and it changes everything about how the rest of the story should be understood. Chapter 5. My punishment is greater than I can bear. My punishment is greater than I can bear, Cain says. Some translations render this slightly differently. Closer to my guilt is too great to be forgiven. And the ambiguity in the original Hebrew is worth sitting with, honestly, because both readings are carried inside the same handful of words, and the text seems almost deliberately to hold them together rather than choosing between them. Punishment too heavy to survive, guilt too heavy to be forgiven. Perhaps in the moment Cain actually spoke, both were true at once, the way they so often are for anyone standing in the wreckage of something they cannot undo. And then Cain says, the thing that I believe is the true emotional center of this entire ancient story, the sentence that everything else, the mark, the protection, the long, strange mercy of what follows, exists to answer. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Listen to what Cain is actually afraid of in this moment. Not primarily the loss of the ground, though he names that too. Not primarily the wandering, though he names that as well. The deepest fear, the one he saves for the very end of his lament, is that whoever finds him will kill him. Cain, who has just taken his own brother's life with what the text strongly implies was calculation and intent, is now terrified of the exact same violence being turned back on himself. He understands, with a clarity that only someone who has just done the thing themselves can understand, precisely how vulnerable an unprotected, marked, wandering man is in a world where he has just demonstrated, in the worst possible way, exactly how easily a human life can be taken. I want to be honest with you about something here. The way this whole tradition has taught us to be honest, even when honesty complicates a story we might prefer simpler. There is a real question. one interpreters across the centuries have wrestled with without ever fully resolving it, about who exactly Cain feared. The text does not tell us the population of the earth at this point beyond Adam, Eve, Cain, and the dead Abel. Later readers, both ancient and modern, have proposed various answers, that there were other children of Adam and Eve not named in this particular narrative, that Cain feared the descendants who would eventually multiply and hear the story of what he had done, that the fear was less about a specific census of potential attackers and more about the newly broken, newly violent character of the world itself, a world that had just learned, through Cain's own hand, that human beings could kill one another and might now do so again to him in return. Whatever the precise mechanics behind the fear, what matters is that God takes it seriously. And what God does next is one of the strangest and most consequential decisions in the entire book of Genesis. Easy to skip past in a single verse, and heavy enough, once you actually stop and weigh it, to reshape how you read everything that came before it. Chapter 6, the mark. Then the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him." I want you to notice first what God does not do here, because the absence is as important as the presence. God does not deny that Cain's crime was real. God does not soften the curse just spoken. The broken relationship with the ground, the sentence of wandering, all of that stands. What God refuses, specifically, pointedly, is Cain's assumption that the appropriate response to his guilt is for someone else to end his life. Not so, God says, using language of direct correction, the same abruptness you might use to stop a child from walking toward a real danger. Whatever Cain believes he deserves, whatever the crowd of imagined avengers waiting somewhere out in the unwritten margins of this story might believe he deserves, God is closing that door, specifically and completely. And then the mark itself, described in a single sparse clause that has generated more speculation across the history of biblical interpretation than almost any other detail in the whole book. The Lord put a mark on Cain. That is all the text tells us, not what it looked like, not where on his body it was placed, not whether it was visible to Cain himself or only to those who might encounter him. Jewish and Christian interpreters across the centuries have proposed a bewildering range of possibilities. A physical brand on the forehead, a set of horns, a trembling that afflicted his body permanently, a change in his very skin, even in some deeply troubling later interpretations that this book firmly rejects, readings that wrongly linked the mark to particular peoples or races, readings that have caused real historical harm and that responsible scholarship today recognizes as a corruption of the text rather than a faithful reading of it. What the text itself commits to without ambiguity is only the mark's purpose. It exists for exactly one reason, lest any who found him should attack him. This is worth saying plainly because it is so easy, hearing the phrase mark of Cain used casually in the centuries since, to assume it names a curse, a visible brand of shame stamped onto a murderer so the whole world would know to recoil from him. But that is precisely backward from what the text actually describes. The mark is not a warning to the world to stay away from Cain in horror. It is a warning to the world not to harm him. It is not a scarlet letter. It is closer in its actual function to the blood painted on the doorposts on the night of the first Passover centuries later in the story of Israel, a sign that exists for exactly one purpose, to turn destruction away from the one who bears it. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because it deserves more than a quick acknowledgement before we move on. The very first act of protective mercy recorded anywhere in the Bible after the expulsion from Eden is extended not to an innocent victim, but to a confessed and unrepentant murderer, a man who, as far as the text records, never once said the words "I am sorry," never once asked for forgiveness, only expressed fear for his own safety in the aftermath of what he had done. And God's response to that fear, offered without any recorded expression of remorse preceding it, was to mark him for protection anyway. I do not think the text wants us to read this as an endorsement of what Cain did. The curse on the ground still stands. The sentence of wandering still stands. Nothing about the mark undoes the reality of Abel's blood, still crying out, in the text's own vivid language, from the ground where it was spilled. But something else is being shown to us here, something the whole tradition we have walked through on other nights keeps returning to in different forms, in Manasseh's chains and his prayer, in the long patience the Psalms call the length of God's nostrils, in the mercy that keeps finding its way through broken generations, even when the ones receiving it have done nothing yet to deserve the finding. The judgment and the mercy are not opposites competing for the final word in this story. They arrive in the very same verse, spoken by the very same voice, extended to the very same undeserving man. God was not finished with Cain. Whatever that meant, whatever shape it would take across the wandering years that followed, the text is unambiguous that it was true. Chapter 7. The Wanderer who built a city. What happens to Cain after he leaves the presence of God is easy to miss, tucked into a handful of verses most readers skim past on their way to the more dramatic stories that follow. But I think these verses matter enormously for understanding what the mark actually accomplished, because they show us, in the plainest possible terms, a life that continued. Cain went away from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden, itself a name that carries the sense of wandering built directly into it, as if the very geography of the story refuses to let us forget the sentence that sent him there. And there, the text tells us, he knew his wife, and she conceived and bore a son, whom he named Enoch. And Cain built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son. I want you to feel the strangeness sitting in that single sentence, because I think it is one of the most quietly astonishing details in the entire early chapters of Genesis. The man who was told he would be a fugitive and a wanderer, unable to make the ground yield to him, built a city. Cities in the ancient world were not the achievements of wanderers. They were the achievements of people who had found a place to stay, who had gathered enough stability and enough community around themselves to build walls and streets, and a name that would outlast a single lifetime. The very curse spoken over Cain, the sentence of permanent instability, did not, in the end, prevent him from building something that endured. Some readers across the centuries have read this as evidence of Cain's continued defiance, a man refusing to accept the wandering God had assigned him, forcing a false stability into existence through sheer will. I understand that reading, and I do not think it is entirely wrong, but I want to offer you another way of hearing this same detail tonight, because I think it fits more honestly with everything the mark itself was trying to accomplish. Perhaps the mark was never meant only to prevent Cain's death at someone else's hand. Perhaps it was meant, in some slower and less dramatic way, to make a life possible at all, a life that would necessarily include a wife and children, and eventually, against every expectation the curse itself might have suggested, walls, and a name, and a place his own son could grow up calling home. The genealogy that follows traces several more generations descending from Cain, inventors and craftsmen among them. The text tells us, the first to work bronze and iron, the first to play the lyre and the pipe, a family line that, whatever its moral complications in the chapters still to come, clearly did not simply vanish into the wilderness and disappear. Cain's line continued. His mark did what it was made to do. I want to name honestly, before we move past this genealogy, that it does not end gently. Several generations down the line, a descendant named Lamech takes the mark's original promise and twists it into something closer to a boast than a plea. If Cain's revenged sevenfold, Lamech says to his two wives, after killing a young man for merely wounding him, then Lamech's is 77-fold. It is worth pausing on this because it shows us something true about mercy that the tradition never tries to hide from us across any of these old stories. A protection given can be received rightly, the way it seems Cain himself eventually received it, walking forward into a marked and chastened life, building rather than destroying. Or it can be received wrongly, twisted by a later generation into a license rather than a mercy. The sevenfold promise turned from a shield into a threat. The mark itself never changes. What changes is what the hands that inherit its legacy choose to do with it. This is not a small detail tacked onto the end of the family record. It is the tradition's own quiet warning that grace received is never the end of the story. It is only ever the beginning of a much longer one. And what comes after remains, generation by generation, still unwritten, still open, still asking to be answered by choice rather than assumed by inheritance. Chapter 8. What kind of God protects a murderer? I promised you at the beginning of tonight's story that we would sit honestly with the question this whole account raises, and I do not want to leave that question unanswered simply because it is uncomfortable. What kind of God, having just watched the first human being to ever be born outside of Eden take the life of the second, responds not with immediate and final justice, but with a mark of ongoing protection? It would have been so much simpler, in the way we usually want our stories to be simple, for God to have ended the account of Cain in that field, or at the edge of it, with a swift and unambiguous justice that closed the door on him the same way the flaming sword had closed the door on his parents. That would have been a story we could file away easily, a clean lesson about consequence, murder answered with an ending, wickedness met immediately by its match. But that is not the story the text actually gives us, and I think the refusal to give us that simpler story is itself the point. The God of Genesis, from these very earliest chapters onward, is repeatedly shown choosing the harder, slower, more complicated path of continuing to be present with people who have already proven themselves capable of the worst things imaginable. Not because the worst things stop mattering. They matter enormously, and the text never once pretends otherwise. But because the story this tradition insists on telling again and again in every book that carries it forward is not a story about a God who is finished with people the moment they fail. It is a story about a God who keeps showing up at the threshold, the way he showed up at Cain's, naming the danger honestly, and then staying close enough afterward to still be there when the worst has already happened. I think the honest answer this ancient text offers us is one the whole biblical tradition returns to again and again in different forms across every book that carries it. And it is this: God's justice and God's mercy have never, in this tradition, been presented as two competing forces taking turns at the wheel. They arrive together in the same verse, spoken by the same voice, extended to the same undeserving recipient, because the character of the God this tradition describes has never been divided against itself in the way we sometimes imagine, punishing with one hand and forgiving with the other, as though they were separate impulses in conflict. The curse on the ground was real. The mark of protection was equally real. Cain was not let off, and Cain was not abandoned. Both things remained true, sitting together, in the same breath, the same way they would remain true many centuries later in the story of a king named Manasseh, who filled Jerusalem with innocent blood and was still, after everything, heard when he finally prayed from the bottom of a foreign prison. There are three kinds of people, I think, who might hear something of themselves in the mark of Cain tonight. The first is the person carrying something they believe has placed them permanently outside the reach of protection, let alone forgiveness. Something real, something with weight and consequence, something that cost another person dearly in a way that cannot be undone by any later regret. If that is you tonight, I do not want to tell you Cain's story erases the reality of what happened in your own field, whatever form that field took. It does not. The ground was cursed. The wandering was real. But hear this plainly, because the text insists on it without qualification. The very first thing God did after naming the full weight of Cain's guilt was to make sure he would not die for it at another hand. The mark came before the repentance, before any recorded remorse, before Cain had done a single thing to earn it beyond simply being afraid and being human. You do not have to have already fixed yourself to be marked for protection tonight. The second is the person who has been able in someone else's story, the one who did everything right, who brought the offering that was accepted, and still ended up bleeding into the ground while someone they trusted walked away and kept building cities. If that is you, this story does not explain your loss away, and I will not pretend it does, but it insists in the same breath that Abel's blood was not silent. It cried out, the text says, and it was heard immediately directly by the same God who was already in that very moment working out justice for what had been done to him. Your cry, whatever form it takes, is not less heard simply because the answer to it did not look the way you expected. The third is the person who is simply tired of wandering, tired of the particular exhaustion of a life spent east of somewhere they can no longer return to. Whether that somewhere was a relationship, a version of themselves, a home that does not exist in the shape it once did. If that is you tonight, Cain's story offers you something quiet and durable to hold on to as you sleep. The wandering was real. It was also not the whole of the story. A city still got built. A son still got named. A life, marked and protected against every threat waiting to end it, was permitted to continue and to matter and to be remembered by name for 3,000 years afterward, not in spite of what happened in that field, but carrying the whole weight of it forward anyway. The field is quiet now. The blood that once cried out from the ground has long since settled into silence. The particular silence of a wound, old enough that even the earth itself has learned to hold it gently. Somewhere east of Eden, in the land of wandering, a city once stood that bore a son's name, built by a man who was told he would never find rest, and who found, however strangely, however undeservedly, that even a fugitive can be marked for keeping rather than for harm. You are not asked tonight to have already earned your own protection. Cain never did. The mark came first. Let that be enough to rest on. Sleep now. The story is complete. And you are held, marked in whatever quiet way this tradition insists we are all marked, against every hand that has ever been raised to finish what your worst moment started. Good night.